the source of funds is basically the EB5 investors, exactly what it sounds like, the source of their capital, right? Now, the government, the US government and USCIS, their real job here is to make sure that any money that's being invested through the EB5 program is the investor's own money that was lawfully obtained, right? So this becomes kind of a two-part analysis, right? One is, where did the money come from? How did the investor come into, how did it come into their possession? And then secondly, have all steps that got them there and ultimately will lead into the investment of the project, were they all done lawfully and under the rules that are basically going to govern each investor's individual source and path of funds, right? So when you're showing the USCIS, the source of funds, what are we talking about? We're talking about ownership of capital, right? You want to show that each investor has true ownership. This is their money to do with as they please, and you want to show where that money came from. I think a really good way to think about it is, okay, you're ready to make your EB5 investment. You've got $800,000 sitting in a bank account somewhere ready to be invested. Let's work backwards from there. Where did this money come from? And you have to go all the way back until basically it came from an institutional or direct source. The second piece then is, okay, why is this so important? Why do we place such an emphasis on the source of funds, right? We obviously hear this term thrown out a lot, but why is everyone so up in arms about this? And the reason for it is, it's such a big piece of the 526E approval, right? What is eventually going to get the green card for the investor, the whole purpose that they're doing this investment in the first place. So if you look at the kind of five criteria that the USCIS is looking at, you'll see that the source of funds is a really critical aspect to at least a few of these, right? So one, the investment amount meeting the EB5 requirements, you've got to have the requisite amount. I think that's a given, right? But not only does it have to be the requisite amount, you have to prove number two, which is that it was lawfully obtained. And if this step doesn't get proven at any point in the process, all the rest of it kind of doesn't even matter, right? If the capital is invested, doesn't matter. If the NCE will create the number of jobs, you're just not going to get to that stage at that point because you haven't even proven one of the main key basics, which is that the investment capital was lawfully obtained. From a practical perspective, when you're looking at an EB5 application, there's two main components, right? One is the project documentation, and the second is the investor's documentation or the source of funds documentation. For pretty much all projects, especially after the RIA, you're going to notice that we've already filed the 956F and it's either been receipted, or in the case of, like, for example, a lot of our projects, it's even been approved, meaning that the investor doesn't have to worry about any of the project documentation at all. That's kind of in the hands of the regional center that they're working with. It's with USCIS already. It's being adjudicated. On the other hand, the investment capital documents, the source of funds that we're talking about, this is where the investor has a lot of control. And this becomes, in many cases, the variable. For most EB5 applications, rarely do you see project-based denials with big reputable regional centers, but you can still see a denial for a source of funds that wasn't properly put together by an experienced attorney. And that's why this ends up being such a key component, because when we talk about variables in the EB5 space, source of funds remains one of the key ones that if you don't understand it very well and you're not working with an experienced attorney, this can be what leads to a denial on your 526E. It's pretty rare to see, a source of funds being clean still leading to a denial. Now, the project we can kind of talk about in a completely different context, and there's a lot of things that can and cannot happen maybe with a project. But assuming that all the project stuff is good, there's only a few other things if the source of funds is also good that could lead to a denial. One of them might be basically arrests or something like that on the immigration side that would lead the person to be inadmissible. They may still actually get their 526E approval in that sense, but down the road, they would actually not be able to adjust or go through the consulate perhaps. Something else that we see is a lot of people focus on the source of funds, but they don't think about the path of funds. And the path of funds is equally important. So what sometimes we'll see is an investor will go through the whole process, source their funds fully. It's a very clean source of funds, but then somewhere between gathering all the funds together and actually making the investment into the project account or the escrow account for the project, we see a break in the path of funds, and we see some kind of maybe they've used a parallel transfer, or they've used a transfer company that maybe wasn't licensed if they're overseas. Maybe it hit a different account when they're in the United States, and that wasn't documented properly. Even if you've got something in the account that is moving the money, that could be a red flag that you didn't even think about because it's kind of separate from your investment funds. Those are all things that you should be aware of. And a good attorney will actually ask you about that proactively, right? They're going to give you strategy advice on how to move the funds around, what's the right steps that you need to take, not just to show the source of the funds, but the ownership of those funds, the path of those funds, and any other kind of external red flags that might pop up in some of your accounts that USCIS is going to have access to that could raise some eyebrows and possibly lead to a denial in the future.